Hello, my name is Matthew Agarwala, and I'm an economist at the University of Cambridge at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. Welcome on this sunny afternoon here from Norwich to the Alumni Festival, and I'm delighted that you've shared some of your afternoon with me to talk about two fundamental competing challenges in the economy: to grow or not to grow. And that really is the question. So as I said, my name's Matthew, and I'm an economist at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. It's a relatively new institute at the University of Cambridge. Our co-directors are Mike Kenny and Diane Coyle, and our overarching goal is to rethink public policy in an era of turbulence and growing inequality. So we have economists, political scientists, sociologists, geographers, psychologists, and climate scientists, and we work with them across the full breadth of research at the university, everything that relates to public policy. There's lots more on the website than we're going to be able to get through today, so do feel free to follow us on Twitter and online. The topic we're going to review today is about two major competing paradigms. What is the overarching strategy for the global economy, and what should that strategy be going forward? And the two different paradigms really, on the face of it, couldn't be more different. On the one hand, we have the growth imperative, the pursuit of continued economic expansion well into the future. And we can see here on the left that growth is a relatively new experience for our species, and that it has been skyrocketing, really shooting off the charts over the past century or century and a half. On the other hand, there's an argument in favor of degrowth, of shrinking the economy, of deliberately designing policy to reduce the size of the global economy, to bring it more in line with environmental boundaries and the carrying capacity of the planet. So what is it? What's the thing to do? Should we grow or shrink our economies? And before we get into answering this question, I think it's really important that we go back and have a little bit of a review of the history over the past century. What has economic growth given us over the past century? Well, it's given us an increase in life expectancy for all people in all parts of the world. Even in the poorest parts of the world, we've seen a huge increase in life expectancy over the past century. This is life expectancy at birth. We've seen increases in literacy rates. We've seen increases in access to education, in food security, a reduction in the number of children who die from easily preventable childhood diseases, and we've seen an increase in access to vaccinations. We have also seen, over the past couple of hundred years, a huge reduction in the proportion of the human population that exists under abject poverty. And this has implications for education, implications for fairness and equity, impacts on, say, the empowerment of women and girls around the world. These huge transformations in the global economy have been accompanied by unprecedented economic growth. And they wouldn't have been possible without that growth. The problem for us now is that we're beginning to realize the undeniable fact that this growth has been accompanied by environmental destruction on a scale which is so significant that it could wipe out the past 2 centuries of economic gain and the past 2 centuries of growth in the human condition and of economic prosperity. Alongside those huge growths in the economic condition, we have seen the release of about 1.5 trillion tons of CO2, which threatens a climate crisis, which could undermine every element of the economy. We know that the contribution to this is very unequal across the world. What we see here is the cumulative CO2 emissions by world region. Not the annual flow, not the change in emissions this year, but the cumulative from 1751 until 2017. And it's pretty clear that the EU 28, the home of the Industrial Revolution, is the primary source of the cumulative emissions that we have released into the atmosphere. But then if we look at what's going on now and today and tomorrow, we see that the biggest growth in addition to CO2 emissions is coming out of the developing and middle income world. Huge CO2 emissions coming from China and from India. And actually some of the wealthier countries have been able to start to reduce the emissions intensity of their GDP. But it's not just climate change. This is absolutely not just a climate change story. We have also seen over the past half century an unprecedented decline in birds, mammals, amphibians, and reptile species. There was an incredibly important report just last week released by the UN, which demonstrated clearly and unequivocally that the world's governments have failed to address any of the targets on biodiversity that we committed to a decade ago. So this spurs and provides the basis for this concern about whether or not we ought to be trying to grow the economy or shrink it, degrow the economy to bring it back in line with nature's boundaries. And there's an important contribution. One of the early thinkers in this respect was an economist named Ken Boulding. And he's got a very used quote, very widely used quote, that anybody who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet is either a madman or an economist. And so the question is, are the economists who think that we can grow really just madmen? Or is there something to it? Can technological development, can innovation actually get us there so that we can have an improved economy, but within the confines of the natural world? So before we go into the specifics of the arguments for degrowth and the arguments against it, I feel I have an obligation to make the point that whichever perspective you end up believing at the end of this talk, we will have to accept that although the relationships between the natural environment and the modern economy are exceedingly complex, they do point to some fairly clear and simple truths. And one of these is that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the natural world. Our economy, whether we're talking about the local greengrocer or the biggest companies on the planet, the whole thing operates and exists within the context and the confines of the natural world. And so whether we're trying to grow the economy, we still have to do it within that context. And whether we're trying to shrink the economy, it still has to fit within nature's capacity to carry our species forward. One of my favorite thinkers on the economics of degrowth is Professor Peter Victor at the University of York in Canada. He's one of the leading proponents of degrowth. And his recent book, which a copy sits on my desk pretty much all the time, goes through very clearly some of the reasons why degrowth might be the future of our species. And the first is that this growth imperative is not new. It's only within the past couple of centuries that we've seen this radical increase in economic output. We can return to a previous economy that didn't have this big growth imperative. Another reason is that degrowth is already here, whether we like it or not. If you look at the growth rates of GDP of the major economies in the world, particularly the United States, the UK, the wealthiest countries, we're already seeing a reduction in their growth rate. So we might have to find a way to manage with reduced growth, even if we don't do so deliberately. The big one, the key one, is that we are already exceeding the planetary boundaries on climate, on biodiversity, on agricultural expansion into biodiverse rich areas. We're exceeding the capacity of the oceans to provide sustainable fish sources. And the final one gets into this idea of decoupling, breaking the link between economic prosperity and our environmental impact. And we're going to come back to decoupling in a couple of slides. But first, let's take a look at the history and see whether we want to return to a low growth economy. Is this really the future, the way forward for us? So we can see that from about 1750 onwards, that's when growth started to take off. And from about 1915 onwards, it started to increase on a truly unprecedented scale. And so the argument from the degrowthers that this imperative to increase the economy and increase economic output every single year, this is new to our species. And we don't have to pursue it. We can make a decision that this is not the objective of public policy. This is not the objective of the economy. However, try this thought experiment. Go back to any point before this growth and think about the living conditions that existed. Are those the conditions that you would want to exist under? I think for most of us, it's probably not the case. Now, the argument that we could potentially shrink the economy and then keep it at a steady state and go forward without growth, without further reductions, that's a possibility too. But you would be imposing on society a perpetual cap that we're never able to expand what we produce and what we consume. One of the arguments for degrowth is that we're already fully grown. So here we're taking a look at the US GDP growth rate, averaged over 10 years, from the 1950s to the present. And if you look from about 1950 to about 2000, the average GDP growth rate annually in the United States was about 2.25%. But more recently, from 2000 to the present, it's only about 1%. Well, why is this? There's a really interesting book by an American economist named Dietrich Vollrath. The book's called Fully Grown, and it came out earlier this year. And it explains that perhaps the slow growth rate is actually a sign of overall success. We have already reached the capacity of the economy to provide goods and services, and we don't have to continue to grow any further. We're able to still produce the same amount, but with fewer labor inputs. People don't have to work as much in order to get the same output. When he decomposes the reduction, so this 1.25% reduction in the annual GDP growth rate that we saw in the last half of the previous century compared to today, he sees that most of it is actually due to a reduction in human capital, a reduction in the workers per capita. Some of it is explained by shift towards more services. Some of it is explained by declining reallocation of workers between sectors. Maybe when people are looking at shifting their jobs or their current employment ends, they're not so interested in trying to pick up and start from scratch in a new, different industry. And we're also seeing a decrease in geographic mobility. The labor force isn't as mobile. People can't move as easily for different jobs. And these are some of the reasons that we've seen a reduction in the growth rate in the United States. The key argument, however, the most difficult to combat, the most important argument for degrowth, is this challenge of decoupling. Decoupling economic growth from environmental damage. We need to break that link if we're to have a sustainable, prosperous future economy. Now, there are two types of decoupling. Relative decoupling simply refers to reducing the intensity, the impact, the environmental impact per dollar of GDP. And this is actually fairly easy to do in an awful lot of cases. We can become a bit more efficient with all of the resources that we use. And that gets us relative decoupling. We can produce the same output with fewer inputs. And that's a relative decoupling. The absolute decoupling, this is the main challenge. This entails reducing the total impact on the biosphere. And that's much harder to do. We've seen vehicles increase in efficiency so that we can drive more miles for the same fuel input. That's our relative decoupling. But what we have also seen at the same time is an increase in the number of vehicles and an increase in the number of miles driven, so that even though we've achieved relative decoupling, we have not achieved absolute decoupling and have in fact increased emissions into the atmosphere. Absolute decoupling is what's needed to bring the economy back within line of the natural environment's capacity. And that's a lot harder to do if we're still growing. To show what I mean about this, I've taken a table, a very informative table from Peter Victor's most recent book. It's called Managing Without Growth, Slower by Design, Not Disaster. And in this book, he points out that it's much easier to achieve the level of decoupling that's necessary if the economy is a bit smaller. So this table, in the first row, we have the annual economic growth rate for an economy. And in the first column on the left-hand side going down, we have the reduction in emissions intensity over time. In the body of the table, we show the combinations between the growth rate and the required reduction in greenhouse gas intensity that would be needed over a period of 35 years. So that if we want to achieve, say, an 80% reduction in emissions within the next 35 years, if the economy grows at a negative 5%, then we can do this. Or if the economy grows at 0%, then we can achieve this with a 5% reduction in the emissions intensity. But if the economy grows at 4%, then we will need a 9% reduction in emissions intensity of GDP. That means we have to be twice as good at becoming more efficient. We need double the relative decoupling in a growing economy than we would have to have in a stagnant, stable economy. So we've seen the challenges and the justifications for degrowth. Now let's think about what some of the options for growth might entail and what some of the arguments for growth might entail. If we want to decouple, break the link between economic output and economic prosperity and environmental damage, we're going to require a huge amount of new innovation. Right? This graph is taken from the UN Global Biodiversity Outlook, published just last week. And what it's showing is the downward trend in biodiversity and what actions we might be able to take to reverse that trend in the loss of biodiversity. We're going to need a whole load of conservation and restoration. We need to radically expand the area of land and the area of ocean that is dedicated as conservation and protected area. But that won't get us the whole way. We also need to change our food system, radically change our food system. The primary driver of species loss on land is agricultural expansion, which means there's habitat loss for nature. And the primary driver of species lost in the ocean is overfishing and fishing down the food chain. If we want to develop an economy that brings us in line with nature's boundaries, we're going to need to develop more climate efficient and more space efficient agriculture and infrastructure. And all of this is going to take huge capital investment. The question is, what kind of economy is best placed to make these investments? One that's growing and booming, or one that's shrinking and depressed? So let's take a look at what's happening in innovation, in new technologies for a green, clean, safe, sustainable economy. What we see here is the growth rate, the projected growth rate in renewables energy capacity. And we see at the bottom of this graph the outlook, the projected outlook from the World Energy Organization in each year from 2000 to the recent past. And what we see in these skinny colored lines is that every single year, the World Energy Outlook has increased its projections for what they expect will be the capacity to generate renewable energy. But every year, it has also massively underestimated those projections. The thick blue line on this graph shows us the actual observed, realized history. That's the actual rollout. And as you can see, every year consistently, they have underestimated the rollout of new renewable energy capacity. And this is because they weren't able to predict the massive increases in efficiency and the massive reduction in cost per kilowatt hour of renewable electricity. And this is happening even now, even today, even this year, even in the midst of the global pandemic, where even in 2020, the projection now is that we will have an increase in renewables rollouts of 5% compared to reductions in coal and oil of 8 and 9%. We can see similar trends in the cost of battery storage, which has come plummeting down over the past decade. The cost of renewable energy have fallen by 85% over the past 10 years or so, and the costs of battery storage have fallen even further. All of this has taken massive investment in infrastructure, in green infrastructure, subsidies up front for just about a decade, maybe a decade and a half. And now what we see is that renewable energy is competitive on cost with fossil fuels in most parts of the world. And these transitions can be incredibly quick. I'm borrowing a slide here from my colleague at the Bennett Institute and at the Grantham Institute at the LSE on transitions and the rate at which technology can be taken up by a population. And I think it's quite inspiring. Here's a picture of Fifth Avenue in New York in 1900. And the challenge for you now is to spot the motor car. Most of these are horse-drawn carriages. But if you can see here, that's the motor car. Now, let's take a picture of the same street 13 years later. Now the challenge is to find the horse-drawn carriage. These transitions, these technological switches, when we get them right, can be unbelievably fast. And so what we might want to do is to continue to grow the economy, continue to create the investment that's necessary to induce this sort of innovation. Right? Now, in the past, we were getting ourselves onto the motor vehicle. Now what we need is a similar transition to get us out of the internal combustion engine and into zero carbon vehicles and mass transportation. Now, there are other arguments in favor of growth as well. What can we possibly say about the developing world, where 2/3 of the global population today still lives on less than $10 per day? How could we possibly, in the wealthy developed West, say to people in these countries that for the purpose of environmental preservation, they must forego growth? And the reality is, when I speak to my colleagues who subscribe to the degrowth paradigm, they will accept that half the global population still needs to grow. Half the global economy still needs to grow. Because it would be unacceptable to tell people on less than $10 a day that this is their cap. So the rest of the world will grow and should grow. But if that's going to happen, then what we need is the innovation, the technological capacity to ensure that when these countries do grow, they can do it with clean, green technologies and not repeat the mistakes that we have made in the past. And that means investment and expansion of capital. And a final concern that I have about the degrowth argument is that it might in fact backfire. massively. It could make things worse. And the reason for this is that degrowth alone isn't enough. Even if we shrink our economy by 10%, that's not enough. If we just reduced the number of vehicles by 10%, we would still have a positive balance of greenhouse emissions going into the atmosphere every year. Even if we shrink the economy, we still need to decouple. We still need to break that link, even between a smaller economy and its environmental impact. And that requires the kind of innovation that we've been talking about, technological, but it also requires social innovation, new ways of meeting with people and working together in ways that enable us to develop economic prosperity, but while reducing our footprint on the planet. We need new markets. We need brokerage services that bring different parts of the circular economy together so that waste outputs from one economic process can be used as valuable inputs into the next. And we really need to focus on the distribution, the inequality. Otherwise, we will not be able to get the fastest growing parts of the economy on board. And I think that all of these things are going to be easier to do in a wealthier economy with more assets in more different asset classes at our disposal. So what are some of the points of agreement? And is there a way forward? Well, I think that most degrowth proponents would agree with the fact that we really still need, even in a shrinking economy, to grow the economy for half the world's population. Both sides, the growth economists and the degrowth economists, will agree that GDP is actually a pretty bad measure of what we ought to try and do over the next century. GDP, gross domestic product, it's not a measure of well-being or of prosperity. It's simply a measure of the value of some of our economic output. And as long as your focus is on whether we should expand or shrink GDP, then you've already lost the plot. It's the wrong conversation to be having. And there's a wonderful book that explains this with all the guts and detail of GDP by our co-director, Diane Coyle at the Bennett Institute. And this is why at the Institute, we're focusing on different objectives, on wealth, on well-being, and on productivity. And I think that the best way forward is going to be to invest in all of the ingredients that make up a modern and productive economy. The environment is one of those, so is human capital, the skills and knowledge of the economy, and so is the physical infrastructure, the roads and machines and transport facilities that we have. But what we need to ensure is that as we build this wealth going forward, we do it within the carrying capacity of the planet. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much for joining me. And I see we have some questions in the chat. So we'll move on to the Q&A session. So we have one question: can we afford to spend money on nature when there are higher priorities right now? This is a good and important question, and I've been receiving it quite a bit. Yes, we can, and yes, we must. The reality is that failing to invest in nature is actually going to cost us an awful lot more than the upfront investment would have been to protect ourselves from the costs of environmental degradation. We know that government budgets are pretty tight these days, but we also know that in the UK, we're spending hundreds of billions, and globally, we're spending tens of trillions on combating coronavirus and sustaining the economy, and we're going to continue to do so to get the economy back on track. The question for us now is, can we ensure that all of this COVID stimulus is being invested in ways that grow a green economy for the future, and not in ways that prop up the dying industries of the previous century? So let me see some of the other questions. There's quite a few of them coming through here. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to all of them. So, is degrowth at all viable with the world population growing? Is anyone prepared to stop population growth? Well, boy, I picked a tricky one. The fact is that although the population is growing now, demographers expect that this will taper off towards the end of the century. But the question from Mr. Richardson is absolutely right, that it's not just the wealth of the economy, it's also the size of the population, and it's really the interaction between the size of the population and their wealth. What we need to do is ensure that as we grow our global population, we will also have to reduce the per capita impact on the environment. Is there anything we can personally do? This is a really good question from Caroline. Thank you very much. Yes, there are lots of things that we as individuals can do. And probably the highest impact, fastest and easiest one is to change our diets. The main driver of biodiversity loss around the world today is our global food system. It's also the global food system that has brought us this pandemic. So what we could do, the fastest thing that we could do, is move towards a more sustainable plant-based diet. Now, I'm not saying everybody has to become a vegetarian tomorrow, but on the margin, if we could make a shift, it would have a huge impact. Another question. In your opinion, what would be a better measurement for growth instead of GDP? Well, thank you very much, Emily, for asking this one. One of the key projects that we have going at the Bennett Institute right now is called the Wealth Economy Project, which I'm lucky enough to be leading at the moment. This project is based on a pretty simple but absolutely foundational economic idea, and it's been developed actually by another Cambridge economist, Professor Partha Dasgupta. And the basic idea is that the size of the pie you can produce in the future depends on the stock of ingredients that you have in the pantry. And if you are running out of ingredients in the pantry, then your future economy is going to be smaller, right? So the economy works exactly the same way, except the ingredients aren't eggs and milk and butter. They're these assets we were talking about, human capital, the skills and knowledge and health of the workforce. They're natural capital, those elements of nature that generate benefits for the economy. Things like pollinators that pollinate crops, things like urban trees and forests that purify the air. It's also produced capital, our physical infrastructure. And it's social capital, the strength of our relationships, the trust that we have in other people and in our governments and institutions. And if we could measure these capitals, the ingredients in the economic pantry, and if we could design policy to enhance our stock of ingredients in the economic pantry, then I think that would be a much better way forward than focusing always just on the size of the pie this year. It would leave us with a better, more resilient stock of wealth that we could deploy when we face shocks like COVID and when we face shocks like climate change. All right, so a question from Chris Warman. It seems to me that one of the biggest problems is/will be to get different nations to conform and cooperate. How do I see this being dealt with? Well, you're right. It's a massive challenge. We need coordinated action, but we also need individual action by countries and individual action by individual people. It's not easy. We have seen in the climate debates over the past quarter century that governments have been willing to commit to targets on paper, but not follow them up with the necessary action when they get back home from the summit. And the same has happened with the biodiversity targets as well. What we do see is that there is a hunger from the general public to put nature at the heart of the COVID recovery. People have enjoyed the cleaner air and the safer traffic-free cycling and the chance to reconnect with nature. And so the general public, whether that's up and down the UK, across France and Germany, or all of Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, I know, I've looked, public opinion polls are clear. We want nature at the heart of the recovery. And what we need is for people to act at the voting booth in order to ensure that their leaders are going to enact environmental policies that will get us there. So how does the Dasgupta review on the cost of biodiversity relate to degrowth? Do you believe that it could have a meaningful impact? If not, what could the UK government do? This is a great question from somebody who is clearly very up to date on what's going on in the UK and the economics of biodiversity. We are very lucky in the UK, actually, to have had a chancellor that commissioned a full economic review by Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta on the economics of biodiversity. Now, it's not the cost of biodiversity as the question suggests, but it's on the full economics of biodiversity. And that report is due the end of this year. And I think it will have some impact. I think it'll have a lot of impact. And there are two reasons for this. First, it sets out the simple fact that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the natural world. We can't escape what happens in nature any more than a smoker's lungs can escape the smoke. We're part of the same integrated system. And anyone who disagrees may as well be living on a different planet. And what Dasgupta will be doing in this report, and his team at the Treasury, is taking these arguments to the heart of economic decision-making in the UK. The question going forward is, will our politicians and will our governments have the guts to deliver the leadership that's necessary to implement what this review is going to tell us? So am I feeling optimistic or pessimistic about rebuilding the economy post-pandemic? It's another difficult question. I borrow a term that I picked up from one of my Bennett colleagues, Dimitri Zangelis. And essentially, he's following the Nobel Prize winning economist, Paul Romer, who makes a distinction between complacent optimism and conditional optimism. Now, complacent optimism is the kind of optimism that a child has on Christmas Day waiting for the presents. They don't have to do anything, they're just excited. And I don't share any of this complacent optimism at the moment for the global economy or for the environment. But conditional optimism, the optimism that you get if you're with your friends and you're trying to build a tree house, and you know that if you get all the supplies together and you put in the time and the effort and you figure out how to do it and you do the work, then you can have this great, wonderful tree house to play in. Well, that's the kind of optimism that I think is warranted at the moment. If we put in the work, if we commit to rethinking our global food system, if we commit to investing in low carbon, climate resilient infrastructure, if we commit to investing in the social capital, the strength of our communities and their ability to adapt to collective action problems, then yes, I think we could rebuild this economy into a cleaner, greener, safer future. How do we ensure a fair transition towards a greener economy? This is a great question, and I haven't had time to put in as much of this into my current talk as I would have liked. We do have a huge project at the LSE on the transition towards a greener economy, and it's absolutely fundamental that we make sure that this is an inclusive transition, that we don't have people whose jobs and livelihoods are dropped off simply because they were skilled in the past for the fossil fuel economy. And so what we need to do is ensure that every new university degree that anybody receives in the UK must be net zero compatible. The skills that our engineers are learning must be for the green economy, not for the old black, dirty, dusty, fossil fuel-based economy. When we recognize that there will be some industries where there will be job losses as we transition, we need to ensure that there are facilities in place to retool and reskill and retrain people so they can join the cleaner, safer, greener tomorrow. What needs to change if the UN in 10 years is not to say again that countries have failed to deliver on their commitments? Never mind taking on the new ones. This is a question from Jeff, and it's a very good one. So thank you for this. Whether we're talking about the biodiversity targets or the climate targets or tree planting targets that we have in the UK, it's always easier to announce these to great fanfare than it is to actually deliver them in practice. So what are the things that we actually need to do to make this happen? Well, the goals need to be smart goals, specific, measurable, achievable, right? But one of the things that I think could really help us is if we invested in the statistical infrastructure so that we could measure and monitor progress towards our goals. And once we can measure and monitor progress, or indeed failure, we're then able to hold governments to account, but we're also able to learn what drove those successes or failures so that we can learn from that in the future. And there are major initiatives around the world at the moment, largely led by the UN, or also the OECD and the World Bank, and colleagues of mine at the Bennett, and myself included, are working on how we can develop environmental accounts and integrate those into the national economic accounts, so that when we develop economic policy, those models already include the environment as a sector in the economy, and the data already includes environmental data. So I think investing in the statistical infrastructure is one of the best things that we could do. And again, in the UK, we're quite lucky. The UK's Office for National Statistics is one of the world leaders in developing environmental economic accounts, and particularly natural capital accounts. And what do their accounts tell us? Well, they tell us that over the past decade and a half, the capacity of renewables generation has increased 11-fold, while the asset value of fossil fuels has decreased 60%. I know which of these I would want my portfolio invested in. Right? They tell us that the value of urban green space to homes in the UK is an additional £78 billion on the asset value of a house. They tell us that the contributions from urban trees in terms of reducing air pollution has saved us 27,500 life years every year. And when we start to learn these things from these environmental accounts, we can make a stronger case to policymakers that these environmental contributions really matter to the economy. A healthy worker is a more productive and more profitable worker. Can we change the way that GDP is measured to decouple growth and mending what is not sustainable? That's a really great question as well. In this book by Diane Coyle, which I put up towards the end of the presentation, she goes through a whole host of unusual oddities about the way that we calculate GDP. And one of the great perversities in the measurement of GDP is that if we have an oil spill that is very expensive to clean up, every penny that we spend on that cleanup is added to GDP and actually makes the number go up. And these defensive expenditures in GDP are really sending the wrong signal. The other issue is that it's a flow measure. It's the size of the pie, where what we really need to focus on is what's going on in the pantry, what's going on in the stock of environmental ingredients, the human, social, natural, and produced capital. I've got a question from Bennett Agarwala, who, if it's the Bennett Agarwala I'm thinking of, is one of the great economists working in this field. So let me read it through. I did not mention one important aspect. For growing in an environmentally sustainable way, we also need institutional innovations. Some kinds of technological changes are not possible without cooperation. Say for India, to conserve water, we need to move to more rainwater harvesting and away from unsustainable groundwater use. For this, community cooperation is essential. She's absolutely right. I wish that I had had more time to go into social capital and the importance of relationships between individuals and between institutions and between different communities. The strength of our communities, this is the most important thing, particularly now in a pandemic. Right? We rely on others to follow the rules to protect us. When it comes to the environment, communities coming together have shown in numerous studies, in numerous cases around the world, that they are able to take over governance of local environmental assets, local ecosystems, and manage them fairly well and sustainably. But what we need is to provide the incentives for them to do so and the institutional infrastructure for them to do so. I've now got 50 questions. Maybe I should be going for shorter answers. One from Terence. How does the world financial system help or hinder environmental problems? At the moment, it doesn't help very much, but it could do. There is a huge interest in greening the financial system, and we're working with central banks all around the world. We are working with financial investors all around the world on how to develop green finance products that provide a return. I'm sorry, I've lost the question. How to develop green finance products that provide a return without destroying the environment. The thing is, it's pretty tricky to do. Investors don't have the time or the capacity to fully investigate all of the environmental impacts that any investment opportunity might provide. What we need is better regulation, better reporting. What we need is for credit ratings agencies to explain the climate exposure of individual companies and even sovereigns to the environmental risks that they face. What about corporates? How should they behave given their historic goal of shareholder maximization? This is a question from Frank. It's a great question. The reality is that there is a whole range of corporate action against climate change, against biodiversity loss, towards the enhancement of social and human capital. But the range is really much too great. We need to get all businesses working on the same page to try to enhance the wealth that underpins the economy. There is a movement largely based in the US at the moment called stakeholder capitalism, which recognizes that all elements of society are really equal stakeholders in the success of companies. Whether that's the environment, whether it's households and workers, whether it's the tax authorities, all of these elements need to be able to work together. Do you think digitalization is a way to improve the efficiency of the economy? That's a great question, and we actually have loads of work going on this at the Bennett at the moment. A lot of this is led by Tanya Feiler and Diane Coyle, looking at how you might govern the digital commons, but also how would we capture the benefits of digital systems, things like YouTube, or even this talk now, for the economy. A lot of these contributions that we get from digital services, like free phone calls via Skype, they're not recorded in GDP statistics. And so actually there's a new piece of research that Diane Coyle's been working on, which shows that GDP would be much, much greater if we incorporated the value of these things into our measurement. I do think that digitalization, AI, and big data will be tremendously important going forward. They'll help us analyze and monitor environmental data, and they'll help us bring together different companies, different elements of a circular economy, so that outputs, waste outputs from one industry can be used as inputs to another. Am I putting too much hope in technological solutions to resolve these problems? Possibly. There is a possibility that I'm putting too much hope on technological solutions to resolve the problems. But I would turn this around as well and say, and ask, how do you think we're going to solve these problems without massive technological solutions? Should environmental audits be mandatory? From Nicole, absolutely, yes, they should, but that's much easier said than done. An environmental audit of a company that produces pencils is very different from an environmental audit of a company that has a very long supply chain, like a supermarket. And that, again, is very different from an economics consultancy. So how do you get these audits so that they are relevant across industries and comparable across companies? That's a huge element of research going on at the moment. There are efforts at the World Bank and at the central bank levels to try and develop something called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. But the real task, the real challenge is the proof is in the pudding. People have to get started with it, and then we'll see what information we can get out of these environmental audits. Let's see. One of the main things that has grown over the recent decades is waste. This is the opposite of efficiency, but has become a seeming requirement for our current economic system. How can this be effectively tackled? It's a great question from Andy. You're absolutely right. We really need to tackle the waste problem. And this is true whether we're talking about waste in the supermarkets, waste at home, throwing out food, or even waste of crops in the field that simply are deemed too ugly to send to a supermarket, just not worth even picking up. We need a agricultural system that incentivizes the use of this food and that disincentivizes the waste. It's hugely costly, it's really inefficient, and we need to fix it. But it's not just the food system, it's also technological goods, it's coffee makers and everyday appliances. The European Union is working on regulations at the moment on the right to repair. And we could also think about different ownership structures, which I think have huge potential going forward. Do I really need to own my fridge or my dishwasher? Or could I rent it from the company? And it's then the company's responsibility to make sure that it lasts and lasts and lasts. And if it breaks down, it's a rental. They have to come and fix it. I think we could change ownership structures in order that companies have an incentive to make things that last, rather than an incentive to make things that will replace quickly. I've still got 40 questions and I think now 6 minutes, so we're not going to get to all of them. Let's see. How do you change individuals' expectations of rising standards of living across generations, countries, and socioeconomic growth, or groups, sorry. It's a great question. I'm not entirely convinced yet that we have to change the individual's expectations of rising living standards, but it depends on how we define those living standards. If we mean rising consumption, then sure, we need to change this. But what we could actually do is see an improvement in the quality of life, an improvement in the human condition, while still reducing the material throughput of the economy. And this would require things like better social relationships. It would require things like people valuing and enjoying their time in nature. We can shift the consumption away from things that are material intensive and towards things that are socially and naturally beneficial for each other and for the environment. So some of these are comments rather than questions. Let's see. I've done this one. Could I tell you a bit more about the work at the Bennett Institute on wealth, well-being, and productivity? Well, yes, I would love to. There are 3 different projects at the moment that I'm involved in at the Bennett. One of them is the wealth economy, which is actually funded by a company called Letter One. And this project is focusing on how we might measure that stock of economic ingredients that's in the economic pantry. Things like measuring social capital, natural capital, human capital. And what we found is actually some pretty interesting results. We found that social capital is really the trust that exists between individuals, and the trust that exists between individuals and their institutions, the government institutions. And that the amount of trust that we place in governments versus in individuals changes over the lifespan. It differs over time, but that all of these matter to the cohesiveness of communities. On well-being, we have a project with the What Works Center for Wellbeing, which is headed by Diane Coyle, and Anna Alexandrova and myself are co-investigators. And this project is looking at how might we measure well-being. If we want to get away from GDP as the be-all and end-all of the economy, maybe we should look at human welfare and human happiness and human well-being. And so this project has two strands. One of them looks at the democratic legitimacy of our measures of well-being and of life satisfaction. When we conduct surveys, are they actually asking and answering the right questions? And the other side looks more quantitatively at how well-being differs across different demographics and across different geographies within the UK. And on productivity, we're delighted to have just received the largest ever economics and social research grant in the UK to set up a brand new center headquartered at the University of Manchester on solving the productivity puzzle here in the UK. So I think we are now out of time. Or do I still have a couple of minutes? All right, I've got one more question. I've got time for one more question then. Let's see if we can pick a great one to end on. Okay, how has the impact of coronavirus affected degrowth? Well, the coronavirus has clearly had a huge negative impact on economies all across the world. We've seen in the UK that in just one quarter, the second quarter of this year, it dropped 20 to 25%. GDP dropped 20 to 25%. But the problem is that the impact on GDP, these drops of 20% or more, has not been matched in lockstep with the reduction in environmental impact. And so what this shows us is that it's actually taken a more than 20% reduction in the size of the economy to get a less than 20% reduction in our environmental footprint. And that, to me, suggests that degrowth alone is not going to be sufficient. And we still need to invest in the infrastructure and the technologies and the social relationships and the business relationships that are necessary to get us away from our material and fossil fuel intensive economy. And I think that's the right place to leave it. All that's left is for me to say thank you very much. I'm sorry that I didn't manage to get to the other questions, but I am on Twitter, so do follow me and I'll do my best to give you a decent answer there. Please do check us out at the Bennett Institute's website and sign up for any events that we have coming up. Thanks very much for your time, and I hope to see you next time.